Webinar. Today is the day we're going to learn more about ICH M11, and we as a team are super excited to welcome Kathie Clark. Kathie is a seasoned professional and has been working in the life sciences industry for the past 25 years. She has a background in eTMF, CTMS, regulatory document management, regulatory information management, and quality management. Next to that, she's also served as a member of the TMF Reference Model Steering Committee. So with that, she's ideally placed to enlighten us on ICH M11. So again, welcome to the show, Kathie. With that, let's kick it off. I've mentioned ICH M11 a few times, but what actually is ICH M11?
Hi, Gert. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I'm speaking to you from Philadelphia in the US. And we're going to talk about ICH M11 at a pretty high level today. And we'll follow up with more details, but it's important to understand that this is a pretty big topic and there's lots more information available. We're going to kind of start at the top. So ICH M11, first of all, it's an initiative from ICH, and probably most of you are familiar with ICH, but in fact, this is a real mouthful. ICH stands for the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. And importantly, this is a joint initiative between the regulatory authorities and industry to develop guidelines for developing, manufacturing, et cetera, pharmaceutical products. So it isn't actually a body that imposes requirements on any health authority, but health authorities tend to adopt its standards either as standards or at least as guidance. So you would, for example, GCP, ICH GCP in the US is not an actual official standard, but it's followed very closely, whereas other standards, such as those for ECTD, are really implemented as standards. So ICH M11 is an initiative that has a goal of ensuring that clinical study protocols are prepared in a consistent manner and provided in a harmonized data exchange format. So those are the really two important parts to know about ICH: consistent format and the ability to exchange data electronically. And it dates back to about October of 2022 when the first versions of these documents were released. And you can see here there are three key documents that were released. They were all released at the same time. And they start with a guidance document. And this really provides background on why this is important to health authorities. So it emphasizes that they need to have consistent data that is both formatted and organized consistently in order to be efficient in their reviews and their assessments and so on. So that's a problem that dates back some years. So for example, some years ago, I worked at a company called Global Submit, and we had a close relationship with the FDA. And one of our projects at the time was a structured clinical protocol. And in talking to the FDA about that, they mentioned things like they spent many hours trying to unpick the trial design by reading the protocol. They were not, sometimes able to immediately compare things like inclusion-exclusion criteria with the actual data. I heard stories from them saying that there were trial sites that actually had no patients that met the inclusion criteria, but that was hard to really determine in an automated way. So this structured protocol project, which never unfortunately came to fruition, was an attempt, and this is back in about 2011 maybe, to try to solve this problem. So health authorities have been concerned about this for many years. And this basic document drives the next two documents, the second of which is the digital template. And this would look to you pretty much like a protocol template. If you open it and look at it, if you haven't already, it would look familiar to anyone who works with protocols. But it defines the headers, the sections, it provides instruction, specific data fields, defines terminology, things like that. But it really provides the framework for treating the information in a digital manner. In other words, not just as a Word document that we have to parse ourselves in a manual way, but something where we know exactly where any piece of information can be found. And if it's important to structure it in a certain way, then it provides instruction on that. Now, still some of this information will be paragraphs of text. Obviously, not everything can be reduced to an exact data element, but a lot of it is. And in fact, I call it like a semi-structured rather than a structured protocol, and we'll talk more about that later. An example might be in terms of exclusion and exclusion criteria, each criteria is just a line of text. So if it says that the subject needs to be between 18 and 45, that's exactly how it's expressed, how a person would say it. It's not broken down into the exact elements that could be readily understood by a computer. And in fact, the details of that are defined in the third document, the technical specification. So that document is a monster. It's 346 pages, and it defines every data field in detail. It defines valid lists of values and things like that. And it defines the groupings of the data in many cases. So a data element might not be a single data point. It might be a set of information. And this goes throughout the protocol. So for example, there's a table of amendments that's structured in a particular way. And that kind of information will be really important when we come to talk a little bit about the downstream effect of digitizing this protocol. So the timeline for this is over the next few years. As we said, this guidance was released in 2022. There was a public comment period. And if you look at the website, by the way, you can see the summary of the comments on all three of these elements in addition to these documents. The documents haven't actually been modified since then. And it's now in what's called Step 2B, ICH Step 2B. And that's when the regulatory members endorse the draft guideline. They say they want to go forward with it. So the next thing that's supposed to happen according to the published schedule is Step 3, which is regulatory consultation and discussion. And that's in October of 2025. So that's the next real major event. And at that point, these documents will be reissued. And again, there'll be another public comment period. And after that, the sign off on the documents is scheduled for November 2025. However, there's one element, which is an implementation guide, a more detailed guide on how to actually implement this guidance that has not been published yet. So that will be in addition to the technical specification. And I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be available, but that's not expected to be signed off until May of 2026. So you're looking around that time when things will start to really get nearer to being something that's actually used in conjunction with the health authorities.
Okay. Thank you very much for the comprehensive overview and giving us some insight on the timelines as well. How does ICH M11 relate to other industry initiatives that we're seeing? How does that relate?
So actually, ICH M11 is related to another very important initiative in industry, which is called digital data flow. So digital data flow is a initiative of CDISC and TransCelerate. And I imagine that you're probably familiar with those, but if just in case, CDISC is a clinical standards organization, and they specialize in structuring clinical data, again, to create standards and controlled vocabularies that are used as standards within those, so that pieces of information are very clear in terms of what they represent and standardized in terms of what they represent. TransCelerate, on the other hand, is an industry organization that brings together different stakeholders, different pharma companies, CROs, et cetera, to solve common industry problems. And they develop processes and tools. And a lot of these are documents, but some of them are actually electronic standards. Most of them are documents that they create after reaching some consensus within their stakeholders on how a certain process should be done. So some examples of things that they've done are framework for risk-based monitoring. They created a standard investigator CV. They created a risk register for clinical trials and a library of risks, things like that. So these are great tools that they produce, and they are obviously interested in and also in supporting a digital protocol. So the important thing to keep in mind about these two initiatives is that they have really different purposes. So ICH M11, as we said, the regulators want to make sure that the protocols are prepared in a consistent fashion and able to be exchanged electronically. The goals of digital data flow are much more ambitious. So you can see there, automate and expedite the study startup process by revolutionizing how data flows across clinical trial system, and that's into the complete execution of the trial. In other words, they're concerned about how this standardized data in the protocol can support the flow of information throughout the entire clinical trial. So they want to produce this machine readable content that can then be exchanged, not just with a regulator, but throughout different clinical processes. So, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but you can see like electronic data capture or a CTMS, a clinical trials management system, or other systems like that aren't, like a CTMS is not a direct concern usually of a health authority, but it's obviously quite central to a life sciences organization running a efficient and properly constructed trial. So originally these were two completely separate initiatives, and they were going down sort of separate paths. And in July of 2024, however, luckily for us, CDISC and ICH signed a memorandum of understanding documenting their intent to collaborate on these processes and to bring them together. So that's really great news for industry that now there is a larger system in place to support the more specific objectives of ICH M11.
That was going to be my next question. How is ICH, TransCelerate and CDISC working together to advance this initiative? You already started on the topic, but how are they going to do this together?
Yeah, so ICH is really calling upon the experience of CDISC in developing electronic standards that are used extensively across the industry already. So that is what their as we say in the US, their bread and butter is. That's their specialty. So they are more experienced at this than an organization like ICH. And they also have a large library of existing content that they can start to integrate with to support M11. And TransCelerate, as we saw, develops processes and practices for industry. So they, again, are ideally placed to help industry support ICH M11. So in terms of specific initiatives within CDISC, controlled terminology. So this means that everything that is appropriate is picked from a standardized list and uses standardized nomenclature. For example, a list of study phases is a very simple thing for us to understand, and then an area where most of us who have worked more than a few weeks in clinical trials know that everybody's got their own list of phases. Everyone's got their own definitions, and even, do we use Arabic or Roman numerals? It's all over the place. So CDISC pulls together things like that, as well as many scientific type of assessments and so on into these lists. Then they'll define this content model, actually agnostic of how it will be exchanged with agencies or other systems. And they'll develop conformance rules. So what that means is, how do I know if my information is valid? Does it validate? Is it consistent? Does it follow all the rules? So for those of you who are familiar with something like an ECTD, you know that every time you submit an application sequence to a health authority, they run it against a set of conformance rules to validate it. And if there's problems, they may end up even rejecting it or sending it back to the sponsor, or advising the sponsor that they should improve certain things next time. So then also develop mappings between M11 and CDISC. So M11 or CDISC already has definitions for many of these fields, these data elements, these lists. And what happens if they don't match what M11 has defined? So there's two things we could do there. We could map them, or we could adapt them. And that will be part of the collaboration between ICH and CDISC. And then finally, there's a joint project with something called Vulcan to deliver an electronic exchange standard. So Vulcan is actually part of Health Level 7, which is, again, another initiative. And their purpose is to close the gap between, for example, clinical care systems and clinical research processes. They focus on a sort of plug and play way to actually exchange data. And an underpinning to all this, something that you'll hear about probably, is something called Unified Study Definition Model, or USDM. That's the CDISC industry standard definition of this data. So the data elements, exactly what each element of data, its type, its length, its list of valid values, those valid value lists, how this information can be grouped together. So, for example, you might group together different items to make up a particular measurement that you would take in a laboratory or something like that. So the relationship between all of this data is also captured there. So that really allows the data to be modeled in the background in a very standard way that then can be understood by electronic systems and can also be used to facilitate people understanding as well.
For pointing out these synergies, which immediately comes to mind when I look at this is, hasn't there been any attempts to do this in the past? Have we not tried to do this in the past? And what is different now than, let's say, in the old days?
Yeah, so there have been some attempts to do this in the past. I even mentioned the one that I worked on with FDA, the structured protocol. But I think what's kind of changed now is that these past attempts haven't really gained a lot of traction for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of times they were kind of point solutions. A single agency was working on them, not a more umbrella organization like ICH. A lot of them were just protocol templates. In fact, one of the health authorities, which I can't remember now, I think in Africa, put out a protocol template within the last 6 months, a recommended protocol template. So this has been going on for some time. A lot of these initiatives in the past were very tech focused. So the FDA one, for example, was really all about the technology. I don't know if they were collaborating with sponsors on that or not. And their value is limited to certain parts of the clinical development process. We'll see that, in fact, this one actually has quite a breadth of impact across the system. It's probably worth noting that TransCelerate did produce a standard protocol template some years ago, and it's my understanding that is used pretty extensively by smaller organizations in life sciences, those that don't have a library of protocols to choose from and a lot of expertise in developing them, that they tend to follow that the TransCelerate protocol template.
Okay. Another question for you. Why do you believe that protocol digitization has the power to transform the clinical information flow? Why?
So in order to understand this, this is a great diagram that was produced by CDISC a while back. And it really shows how the protocol is at the center of the whole clinical trial process. So the clinical protocol is created using data standards that have been predefined, that are usually required by the health authorities. The clinical development plan obviously feeds into it, the endpoints. But once you have that information, that can be used to drive many aspects further down. So the reason why it has the power to transform it a lot is it solves a lot of problems that exist now. So I watched a digital data flow webinar recently where the speaker said that he had spoken with someone at a top pharma company who told him that 50% of the data points in the clinical protocol were incorrectly transcribed into other systems. And that's pretty huge. So that shows that there are problems in handoffs, missed handoffs, inconsistencies. You don't have a single source of truth that's readily available to everyone. And you're doing all this manual work that then is wasteful and time consuming. In addition, because it's not digital, we don't have the ability to automate the way we would like in order to drive those downstream processes. So if you look at some of those downstream processes, first of all, you have the one that ICH M11 is really focusing on is this single green line going down to FDA, EMA, and PMDA, and obviously many other health authorities. So that is sending the protocol to the agency. But if we look at all of the electronic systems and processes that are used in the trial, so we also have the clinical trial registries. And if you've looked at, I'm mostly familiar with CTISC and clinicaltrials.gov, but of course there's many. They have radically different ways of structuring information to go into those, which now has to be mapped from a single source to say, okay, well, what do I use in this field? What do I use in this field? Then we have systems like CTMS, which historically CTMS is not driven by standards. It's driven by the sponsors and CROs and what they need to manage a trial. So there was no reason to standardize it, and that means that whenever you do anything like a migration or an import of data, it's a very difficult effort, and this is also a source of a lot of handoffs. So CTMS can be structured because we know more about the trial digitally. eTMF can be structured, and we can even drive what information we need in the eTMF based on the details of the trial. Is this a randomized trial? Then we need a randomization plan. Is it a blinded trial? Then we need an unblinding procedure, and many other things. And then RIM, of course. So now we know the details of this clinical study. We can generate RIM processes that we need to register the study with the health authorities and to maintain updates to those registrations. Then we get into things like statistical analysis plan. Obviously, that's based on information in the protocol. EDC, we're looking to say, well, we could actually define an electronic case report form, at least in part based on the information in the protocol that's digital. E-learning, what kinds of training do we need to conduct based on the protocol? And randomization and trial supply. So how are we randomizing the patients, and what supplies do we need to deliver to the patients? And then any sort of reference materials. So you can see there's like a vast ecosystem of information that can be partially or even totally, in some cases, automated if we know the information about the clinical protocol and it's standard and it's structured in a way that we know that it'll be complete. So really the themes are automation, consistency, and completeness, which is not entirely true with M11. That's really focused on standardizing information that's given to the health authorities.
It sounds like a lot of IT and a lot of technical work. How would this look to a person who just wants to read and go ahead and work with a protocol?
So tools are really key here. And I think that everybody involved envisions this as being something that where a protocol is still presented to a person in a form that's not that much different than what they're doing now. But from there, because the data flows so seamlessly, it might be quite easy, for example, to click on a section of the protocol and go off into another system. And be able to follow what you say you have to do in the protocol into the places where you actually do that process, that work. In terms of creating it, I mean, if you look at that technical specification, nobody would really want to be going in there and hacking away at creating a protocol based on that. There will be tools that guide you through the process of entering the data, and therefore it'll actually be probably easier because you can pull from libraries of sections, responses, and data. You can see what you've done in the past and populate sections of the protocol based on that, as opposed to sort of cutting and pasting from other documents.
Okay, it sounds like once all of this is in place, the whole process would be quite automated. Is there anything that AI could do to contribute to clinical trial information, to the clinical trial information flow at that point?
I think there's lots of things that you could do, and these are really Kathie Clark's ideas. And I've heard some speakers talk about them, and I've sort of taken on board some of the things that they've said. But some ideas that I have. Well, first of all, I talked about that mapping. What happens if you have another system that's not using those definitions or those data structures yet? So I might be able to use AI to map the requirements of M11 and DDF into, say, an EDC, which hasn't been updated to actually be built against that standard, or a CTMS that hasn't been updated to use that standard. But I think some of the more interesting things are interacting with the protocol in a different way. So, for example, advice on the protocol. If I compare this to when a similar protocol has been done in the past, did it result in an excessive number of protocol deviations? And tell me why you think that might be. Did it contribute to high patient dropout or discontinuation? And we could present it in an early form to the sites, the investigators, and have them question it and comment on it based on what they think the feasibility is. We could use AI to make sure that it's complete and consistent, consistent with other protocols, consistent internally in ways that maybe even the rules don't understand. We could ask for the impact of a protocol amendment. What's the impact of this amendment likely to be? We could also help patients to understand the protocol, so they could have a chat with it and ask questions about it. And we could use it to predict in detail what documents we need in the trial master file, so that we understand how to assess the completeness of our body of documentation well in advance of health authority inspection. So there's probably lots of other things, but those ideas kind of come to mind immediately.
Okay, and then maybe one last question, because I see we're nearing the end of the webinar. What can we do? What can the industry do, life sciences organizations, to get ready for all of this?
I'd say big pharma are already tracking this pretty closely. And in fact, there have been some proofs of concept that have been done by some of the larger companies where they created an M11 protocol. And that's obviously difficult for smaller organizations to be involved at that kind of level. So there's a lot of things that you can do now, and they shouldn't have to be that time consuming. So if you haven't already, I would start by reading the overview document, which is quite brief, and by taking a look at the protocol template, just to kind of familiarize yourself with how it's been constructed. It doesn't mean you have to review every section in excruciating detail, but just to get a feel for how this will be structured. So the template is a little bit more, not completely, but a little bit more looking like what you would be working with directly. I wouldn't spend a lot of time right now on the technical specification. As I said, that's like a 346-page monster. Yeah, if you're on the technical side, you might take a quick look at it. But an important thing is to really continue to monitor the project timeline and milestones. So anticipate when the next versions are coming out. Consider participating in the public comment period. and really kind of just make sure you're aware of when things are supposed to happen. Who knows if this timeline will hold, but if it does hold, we're not talking that many years off. You can check out CDISC's website. They have a lot of resources there. There are other recorded webinars that go into much more detail about many aspects of what we've talked about today. There's also a list of vendors on the CDISC site. So these are vendors that have started to create specific tools related to M11, and CDISC, they emphasize the fact that they are not endorsing these vendors, they are just listing them. But if there's something that catches your interest, you could ask one of these vendors for a discussion or a demo. And then that timeline really drives the need as you get closer to have a more concrete plan for how to get on board with M11 and the digital protocol. So I think those are things you can do that aren't investing large amounts of time, but that will keep you informed and able to be ready when something really has to be done.
Okay. With that, Katie, we've reached the end of our allotted time, I would say. I'd really like to thank you on behalf of the whole community, all our watchers and people who will watch the recording of the webinar as well, for bringing this valuable content to our audience. The evening is falling here in Belgium because I'm not, unlike you, not in the US. I want to thank you again, thank the audience, and we hope to see you at one of our other or upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for enlightening us on ICH M11, Katie. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.